Being a single father is sometimes like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. Every step feels like it could be painful, and no matter how careful you are, you always get burned. My life hasn't been great. Far from it. A dead-end job at a local hardware store, overdue bills piling up on the counter, and more sleepless nights than I could count. But there was one bright spot in it all. My son, Danny. He was the kind of kid who would smile his way through just about everything. He deserved way more than I could hope to give him, yet he never so much as complained, even when he had all the reason to. He worked hard at school, did his chores without grumbling, and always tried to cheer me up when he saw me staring at the stack of envelopes marked past due. It was just a week before Christmas when he came home from school, his face lit up with that kind of pure joy only kids seem to have. He'd been going on about this toy for months, a limited edition figure from Mackey's Funtime Playhouse. Mackey's was a live-action show in our small town with over-the-top mascots, characters in bright, oversized costumes, and a line of toys that drove the local kids insane with obsession. The one Danny wanted, Mega Mackey Deluxe, was the crown jewel of the set. "Dad! Dad!" he said, practically bouncing with excitement. "Mrs. Higgins said I'm getting an award at school for doing so good on my tests. You remember what you said, right?" My heart sank. This was the best, worst-case scenario. To get him to do well in school, I promised to get him the toy he wanted if he did well. Lately, he'd been struggling, so it was motivation to improve. The catch is that it was the hot seasonal toy, near impossible to get, especially this late into December. But now, here he was, looking at me with those big, hopeful eyes, and I couldn't bear to let him down. "Of course, buddy," I said, feeling a hole open up in my chest. "I'll get it for you, just like I promised. You earned it." Danny turned around and ran off to tell his stuffed animals the good news. I sat there, staring at my hands, knowing I had no idea how I was going to pull this off. The toy wasn't just expensive, it was impossible to find. Every store was sold out, and resellers were charging hundreds online. I didn't even have enough in my account to cover groceries for the week, let alone some overpriced hunk of plastic. But I couldn't break my promise to Danny. He'd done everything I'd asked of him, and then some. I couldn't let him think his hard work didn't matter. And that's how I found myself parked outside the Mackey's warehouse at 3 a.m. I checked every retailer in a realistic travelable radius, and a few I knew I couldn't get to. None in stock. I'd even entered phony-sounding raffles with no luck. It wasn't like I planned it ever since I promised it to Danny. I'd driven by the warehouse dozens of times on my way to work. A massive, ugly building on the edge of town, surrounded by chain-link fences and flickering floodlights. Each time I'd gone past, the security seemed lax, a single old man standing guard. I didn't even have to cut the fence. Someone else already had. Probably teenagers looking for a thrill. They must have been young, because instead of the broken fence being pushed in, it was peeled outward. Such an inefficient way of breaking in. Slipping through the gap, I crept toward the loading dock. My heart pounding so loud, I was sure it would wake the whole town up. The warehouse smelled like stale plastic and motor oil, an industrial smell that had a bitter cling to it. The air was cold, biting at my skin as I tiptoed between the towering shelves. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, each step feeling like it could set off an alarm, even though the place was clearly unguarded. Then I stumbled upon the mascot suits. They stood in a line near the back, the oversized fabric-woven heads cocked slightly to one side. Mackie the fox, Cheery the bee, and Giggles the clown. 3 life-size suits, their colours faded under the small amount of illumination the moon provided. I hurried past them, swallowing the dryness in my throat. I wasn't there to gawk at creepy costumes. I was there for Danny. I finally found the toy aisle. Rows of brightly coloured boxes lined the shelves, all of them holding smiling, cartoonish mascots of Mackie's Funtime Playhouse inside. Mackie was front and centre on most of the packaging. A red and orange anthropomorphic fox with a wide grin. He wore a striped vest and a crooked top hat. And on the middle shelves was a lineup of Mega Mackie Deluxes. The box was bigger than I'd expected. The figure inside was detailed, almost disturbingly so, with joints that looked like they could move independently. It came with a miniature version of Mackie's signature stage, complete with tiny props and battery-powered spotlights. The words, "The Ultimate Show Fox," were scrawled across the front in bold, glittery letters. I grabbed it and clutched it to my chest, and I turned to leave, my heart pounding louder than my footsteps. The warehouse was deathly silent, save for the occasional creak of the building. As I approached the section where I'd seen the mascot earlier, I froze. One of them was gone. This meant there were still people working here, moving around stock and products. I would have to be attentive for people lurking around. Mackie and Giggles were still there, standing stiff, but Cheery was missing. Then, a faint shuffling sound, followed by the clatter of something metal hitting the floor. I ducked behind a shelf, clutching the toy to my chest so hard I could hear the box crinkle slightly. The sound grew louder, and my pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. "Please don't catch me." I repeated that same sentence over and over again in my head. I peeked through the gap between 2 boxes, and I saw movement in the dim light. My fear swelled to a boil, and I bit my lip to keep myself from making a sound. Then the figure stepped into view. It was an old man. The security guard, tired, hunched over and muttering to himself, was dragging a mop bucket across the floor. He stopped near the aisle of costumes, moving things around like he was organizing them. I slumped against the back shelf, my chest heaving as relief flooded me. It was just some guy doing his job. I stayed crouched, watching the guard shuffle down the aisle. He didn't seem in a hurry, and every scrape of the mop on the floor felt like nails on a chalkboard. I needed to get out. I was robbing the place, and the longer I stayed still, the more that fact sunk into my bones. I hugged the toy tighter and crept toward the far end of the shelf, keeping my steps light and slow. The guard mumbled something under his breath and moved to another section of the warehouse. The sound of his mop bucket squeaking on its wheels gave me enough sound to slip past unnoticed. Finally, I slipped through the gap in the fence, my legs shaking with adrenaline as I broke into a jog back to my car. The ride home felt surreal, but for the first time in a while, I wasn't consumed by the dread of bills and bad decisions. The only thing I thought of was Danny's face when he'd see the toy. After everything the kid had done for me, his hard work and his big hopeful eyes, he'd finally have something to smile about. I didn't feel proud about what I'd done. Not exactly. Stealing wasn't something I thought I'd ever do. But life has a way of forcing your hand. I'd never been able to provide for Danny with much, and I'd spent too many sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if he resented me for it. But this finally felt like a win. A stolen and guilty win, but a win nonetheless. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the living room lamp I'd left on. I stepped inside, careful not to make too much noise, and placed the toy on the kitchen counter. The next morning, Danny would wake up to the best surprise of his life. I could already hear his excited laughter, imagining his face light up as he tore open the box. Smiling to myself, I headed to bed. The exhaustion hit me like a freight train, and before I knew it, I was out cold. The following morning, I woke up earlier than usual, my body aching from the tension of the night before, but a sense of calmness settled over me. Today would be a great day. I shuffled into the kitchen, planning to finally hand Danny his present. But it wasn't there. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the room, a million thoughts rushing through my head. My eyes finally landed on it. It was sitting on the dining table now, perfectly centered. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the curtains of sleep. I was tired from the previous night, so I probably didn't even remember where I'd put it. I shrugged it off and made my way to Danny's room with the toy in hand. He was already awake, sitting up in bed and rubbing his eyes. When he saw me standing in the doorway, holding the toy, his face lit up like I'd just handed him the world. "Dad!" he shouted, throwing off the covers and scrambling to his feet. Did you? I couldn't help but laugh. "It's all yours, buddy. You earned it." He tore the box out of my hands, practically vibrating with excitement as he examined it. "Oh my gosh, it's the Mega Mackie Deluxe! This is the best day ever!" Watching him was like a balm to my soul. The way he turned the box over and over, reading every detail, the way he hugged it like it was his most prized possession. I felt like, for once, I'd done something right. "Thanks, Dad," Danny said, beaming up at me. "You're the best." I ruffled his hair, barely able to stand from the overwhelming emotion. "You're welcome, son. Just don't forget, this was because of how hard you worked. I'm proud of you." For a brief moment, the guilt melted away, replaced by something I hadn't felt in a long time. Happiness. Danny was happy, and that was all that mattered. After Danny got his toy, I went back to work, cycling through the motions of stocking shelves and helping customers. The guilt of having stolen something and the exhaustion that followed was a heavy combination, but I kept telling myself it was worth it, for my son. By mid-afternoon, I stepped outside for a smoke break. The cold December air hit me as I leaned against the brick wall of the hardware store, taking a drag and letting the nicotine reset my mood. I took a glance around the parking lot, thinking of what I was going to make for dinner for Danny and I. When I saw it. Across the lot, near the edge of the street, stood Mackie, the fox. Memories of the warehouse rushed back to me, but I cast it aside. It was just someone in a costume, probably on their way to a kid's Christmas party. The red and orange suit looked identical to the one I'd seen in the warehouse, down to the crooked top hat. But I guess it made sense. I took another drag. My heart thudded unevenly in my chest. Huh, I muttered to myself, blowing out a stream of smoke. Mackie really was popular, and I never really paid much attention to it prior. Even on my drive to work, I noticed billboards with Mackie and the crew posted everywhere, people wearing the merchandise and such. It was no wonder Danny was infatuated with them. After a few seconds, the person turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the building. I shook my head and forced a chuckle as I headed back into the store to finish my shift. When I got home that night, Danny was playing in his room with his new toy, the lights of the battery-powered spotlight flashing on and off, filtering into the hallway. It was comforting, a reminder of why I'd done what I did. The next morning, I got ready to head to work, already slowly forgetting the events that transpired over the last few days. The morning traffic crawled under a sky smeared with dull clouds. I tried to focus on the road, but everywhere I looked, there was Mackie and the crew. Billboards, huge garish signs towering over intersections. Mackie's grinning face loomed above the city with his crooked top hat. One after another, the billboards lined the streets like massive sentinels, each one more obnoxiously colourful than the last. I wondered to myself how I'd never noticed all of it. At the bus stop, posters were plastered across the glass shelters, showing Mackie and his gang, Cheery, Giggles, and a few others I did not recognise, posing with exaggerated expressions. Some kids waiting for the bus wearing Mackie-themed backpacks, their lunchboxes sporting the same gleaming smile. At a red light, I glanced over to my right out of habit. And there he was. Someone wearing that same Mackie the Fox costume. Standing on the sidewalk, no more than 10 feet away, his crooked top hat slightly tilted, his bright red and orange costume clashing against the grey of the morning. He wasn't moving or waving like a mascot at some promotion. He was just standing there, facing me, staring. I felt my grip on the steering wheel instinctively tighten. The light turned green, and I snapped my gaze forward and pressed on the gas. The car rolled forward, and for a moment, the tension in my shoulders started to ease. I risked a glance in the side mirror, and I saw Mackie, still unmoving. Every part of him stayed still, except for his head, which kept tracking my car. I pressed harder on the gas, the engine groaning as my car sped up. When I looked in the rearview mirror again, he was gone. For a long time, I drove in silence, thinking about what I'd just seen. It had to be a coincidence, some person in a costume again, an overzealous fan trying to get a reaction out of people. And ordinarily, that would have eased my mind. But after what I did, I couldn't help but linger on strange theories and conspiracies. The rest of the day dragged on, but I eventually managed to push the strange encounter out of my mind. It was just some jerk messing with people and happened to pick me. That's what I kept telling myself, repeating it like a mantra to keep the unease at bay. By the time my shift ended, the winter sun had already dropped way below the horizon, casting the streets in an early darkness. The air was sharp as I walked to my car, my breath misting in front of me. The lot was mostly empty, as it usually was, just a few scattered cars under the flickers of the overhead lights. I pulled out of the lot, heading down the narrow, mostly abandoned back roads that shaved a few minutes off my drive home. The darkness pressed against the car window, the streetlights few and far between. About halfway through the drive, I saw something up ahead. Something red and orange, standing in the middle of the road. I slowed the car, my stomach tightening as the shape came into clear focus. It was Mackie. The costume was unmistakable, but something was different. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, but then I realized he wasn't standing still. Mackie's limbs were twitching and spasming, jerking in sharp, jittery motions. His head twitched violently to the side, snapping back upright a moment later. His gaze wasn't fixed on me. It stared off to the side of the road. It was like watching a puppet with its strings tangled, a series of unnatural jolts that made my joints hurt. My car slowed to a crawl as I stared ahead. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. As I sat frozen, Mackie's spasms momentarily stopped. He stood perfectly still now. Then, in one horrifyingly fluid motion, he dropped to all fours and snapped his head in my direction. The blood drained from my entire body as it started moving toward me. His body contorted unnaturally as he accelerated to a gallop. I punched the gas pedal in protest, the tires screeching as the car surged forward toward the thing. My mind screamed as I gripped the wheel, eyes locked ahead. I swerved just past the thing, narrowly avoiding veering off-road. I stole a glance in the rearview mirror, and I realized Mackie was still chasing me, his form illuminated by the red glow of my taillights. I checked ahead, making sure I wasn't about to rear-end someone full speed. When I looked back again, he was gone. I scanned the mirror as frantically as I could, but the road behind me was empty. My hands trembled as I forced myself to focus, breathing hard as I sped toward the main road. I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station, and as I did, I leaned my head to rest against the steering wheel. My entire body was shaking, my pulse hammering behind my eyes. This was no human in a costume. Everything that I just witnessed was anything but human. And that's when I realized the security guard back at the warehouse hadn't seen me that night. He hadn't been the reason I'd felt so on edge. But Mackie and the others had. That must have been why there was a costume missing when I checked again. He'd been looking for me this entire time. It knew I stole from him. I sat there in the dim light of the gas station. No matter how much I wanted to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was all in my head, I couldn't shake Mackie's twisted form out of my head. The toy kept some connection between those things and my son and I. I had to get rid of it. When I got home, the house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen and Danny's laughter as he played in his room. I didn't have to look to know he was playing with the toy I had stolen for him. I hesitated as I thought about what I had to do. Danny loved that toy more than anything. The joy on his face when I gave it to him had been the whole reason I did what I did. But I couldn't let him be near it for another second. What if it came for him the same way it had come for me? Still, knowing what had to be done didn't make doing it any easier. After it got late, I told him it was time to sleep, I waited until I heard his laughter fade, replaced by the steady silence as he drifted off to sleep. The house was dark as I crept toward his room. The toy was on the floor next to his bed, the faint glow of its tiny spotlight reflecting off the walls. Danny's small hand dangled off the edge of the mattress, inches away from it. I bent down, careful not to make a sound. The plastic was cool and smooth under my fingers as I picked it up. For a moment, I froze. Danny stirred in his sleep, mumbling something I couldn't make out. My grip on the toy tightened, and I fought the urge to put it back. I slipped out of his room and made my way to the kitchen, where the garbage bin sat just outside the back door. My breath fogged in the cold night air as I stepped outside, clutching the toy tightly. The bin loomed ahead of me, and I felt a strange mix of relief and dread as I approached. This was it. I was going to get rid of it, finally sever whatever connection it had to us. Just as I raised the toy and tossed it in, I froze. Mackie was standing at the edge of the yard. I couldn't see him clearly, but he was unmistakable. Shades of his signature red and orange, the cartoon proportions of a fox. His silhouette was barely illuminated by the pale light of the moon, but I could see him clearly enough. My body locked up, panic surging through me like an electric shock. He raised one arm in slow motion towards me, almost like he was beckoning me to move to him, but there was no chance in hell that I would approach that thing. I turned and bolted back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess. He hadn't attacked me, hadn't chased me, not this time. He just stood there, watching me. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing and trying not to wake Danny up. The moment replayed in my head over and over again. I hoped that by getting rid of the toy, that would satiate whatever was happening. I locked every door and window in the house and checked the perimeter from the safety of the house. Everything was clear. It wasn't easy, but eventually, I found sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sounds of Danny running around. He was making little noises, and my heart broke. He must have been looking for what he was calling his best friend, which I'd thrown away like garbage. I felt awful and got up, preparing words to try to get him through the heartbreak. But as I got closer, the noises weren't of panic, but of fun. I stepped into the kitchen area, and Danny was sat, ready for breakfast, swooshing his toy around like it was flying. Mackie. It was back. No signs of marring from sitting in the trash all night. I quickly wiped away my look of shock, knowing I'd have no way to explain it. I made breakfast quietly with my best forced smile. I sent him off to school and resigned myself to my fate, because I already knew what would happen that day. Mackie. Everywhere, leering in places that only I seemed to look. If there was doubt that he was only after me, it was wiped away after that day. But one constant had become clear. His raised arm, beckoning me, taunting me, or telling me something. That night, as I thought about everything I'd seen, I started to realize that Mackie might not have been pointing at me. Maybe he was pointing at the toy I was holding. What if he didn't want me? What if he just wanted the toy back? Without giving myself time to second guess, I snuck in Danny's room and slowly lifted the toy. I grabbed the car keys and headed out again. Mackie was nowhere to be found, but I knew where he'd be waiting for me. The drive to the warehouse was a blur, the dark roads rushing past in a haze of fear and determination. When I finally pulled into the lot, the building loomed ahead of me, its shadow stretching across the cracked asphalt. I stepped out of the car, gripping the toy so hard my knuckles ached. The warehouse was just as silent and empty as it had been that night, but now it felt menacing. Taking a deep breath, I pushed through the gap in the fence and made my way inside. This time, the cutout in the fence was turned facing in. Intrusive thoughts came in my head, thinking that this must have been how Mackie got in and out. But I pushed them away, focusing on what I was there to do. I entered the warehouse and navigated my way around the labyrinth of shelves. Mackie, Cheery, Giggles, all of them were back in their spots, standing just the same as the first time I'd seen them. I stepped forward, trembling as I stood in front of them. For a moment, nothing happened. So, I spoke up. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my voice shaking more than I was. "I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would. I just wanted to do something nice for my kid." The words tumbled out of me, clumsy and desperate. He's been doing so well, you know. I just wanted to make him happy. That's all. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, I swear. I lowered the toy slowly, placing it on the cold concrete floor in front of me. I shouldn't have taken it. I know that now. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. My voice cracked as I backed away, my gaze locked on Mackie's empty eyes. The silence was unbearable, the stillness suffocating. I stood there for a moment longer, waiting for something to happen, but the mascots didn't move. They didn't need to. Their presence alone felt like judgment. So I turned and left. I didn't get pursued by anything, and I arrived home. Danny was fast asleep in his room, his small body curled up under the covers. The sight of his empty arms made my heart ache. He'd fallen asleep holding that same toy every night since I'd given it to him. And tomorrow, he'd wake up to find it gone. I stared at him for a moment, soaking in the last of his blissful happiness before it would be ripped away. He was such a good kid. He deserved a father better than I. I'd taken his favorite thing away to protect him, but there was no way he would understand that. When I finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining Danny waking up, searching for his toy, his bright smile fading when he realized it was gone. I kept telling myself I'd done the right thing, that I'd kept him safe, but it still felt like I'd failed him. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of Danny screaming. I bolted upright, my heart racing as I stumbled out of bed. Adrenaline was coursing through me, knowing I could have been wrong about the whole situation. Was he back? Thoughts of Mackie hurting my son swirled around my head. I rushed to his room, ready for anything, even the worst. Danny was sitting in the middle of his bed, surrounded by boxes. A full set of Mackie's Funtime Playhouse toys. "Dad, how did you do this?" Danny's grin stretched ear to ear, his eyes sparkling with pure joy. "You got all of them for me." I blinked, my brain struggling to catch up. The toys hadn't been here before. I knew that. I'd taken the one toy, the only one we had, and left it in the warehouse. But Danny didn't notice my confusion. He held up one of the figures fresh out of the box, Giggles the clown, and hugged it tightly. "I can't believe it. You got the whole set. You're the best, Dad." The only one that wasn't boxed was Mackie. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. I wanted to tell him the truth, that I hadn't done this, but the sheer happiness on his face stopped me. Instead, I managed a weak smile. "You deserve it, buddy," I said softly. Danny beamed, grabbing another figure, unboxing it, and setting up an elaborate play scene on his bed. His laughter filled the room, bright and unrestrained. I backed out of the room quietly, giving him space to enjoy his new treasures. Once the door closed, I leaned against it, exhaling a shaky breath. I'd left the one in the warehouse, apologized for stealing it, and walked away. Somehow, they ended up here, in Danny's room, as though... I shook my head, unwilling to finish the thought. It didn't matter. Danny was happy. Maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay.